The sound of crystal shattering on marble floor is something you never forget. Not because of the embarrassment, not because of the way every head in the room turns toward you at once. That slow, collective pivot of the wealthy and the well-dressed. Their champagne flutes frozen midair, their conversation suspended like a held breath. You never forget it because of what happens right after. The silence. That specific, surgical silence that a room full of people with old money and sharp eyes can produce when they want you to feel exactly how small they believe you are. That was the night I had been waiting for. That was the night everything changed. But to understand what happened in that ballroom, you need to understand what happened long before it. You need to understand the woman I was when I walked into that family, and the woman I had quietly, methodically, invisibly become. You need to understand the kind of humiliation that doesn't leave bruises, the kind that seeps into your bones over years, slow and cold, like water finding the cracks in stone. And you need to understand that the most dangerous person in any room is never the loudest one. It's the one who has been underestimated for so long that she stopped correcting people. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of the night I stopped being invisible. I grew up in a small town in Ohio that most people drive through without stopping. The kind of place where the diner on Main Street has been serving the same blue plate special for 30 years, where everybody knows your mother's name and your grandmother's story, and where the biggest event of the year is the county fair in August. We weren't poor in the way that makes for dramatic storytelling. We weren't rich either. My father worked at the plant. My mother cleaned houses for families who lived on the better side of town. We had what we needed, most of the time. We had each other, all of the time. What we also had was a computer. It was old when we got it. My father had bought it secondhand from the electronics shop where his colleague's son worked part-time. It was slow, and it made a sound like a small animal in distress whenever you tried to run 2 programs at once. But to me, at 11 years old, it was the most extraordinary thing I had ever seen. I remember the first time I wrote a line of code. I'd found a book at the public library, a thick, battered volume with a laminated cover that was peeling at the corners. And I'd sat at that kitchen table every night for 3 weeks, teaching myself. My mother would bring me a glass of water before she went to bed. She never asked what I was doing. She trusted that whatever it was, it mattered, because she could see in my face that it mattered. That computer was where everything started. Not with money. Not with a vision board or an investor pitch. Just a girl, a borrowed book, and the stubborn belief that the world inside that glowing screen had more room for her than the world outside. I was a scholarship student at Ohio State, computer science on a full academic scholarship, and I worked 20 hours a week at a campus cafe to cover everything the scholarship didn't. I didn't go to parties. I didn't join sororities. I ate a lot of ramen, and I slept about 5 hours a night. And I wrote code in the margins of my notebooks and on the backs of paper coffee cups. And I was, despite all of it, the happiest I had ever been. That's where I met Daniel. Daniel Hartwell walked into the campus cafe on a Tuesday afternoon in October during my junior year. He was tall, classically handsome, in a way that seemed almost accidental, like he'd been born into good bone structure, the same way he'd been born into his family's Connecticut estate. Not because he'd earned it, but simply because the universe had arranged things that way. He ordered a black coffee and left a tip that was larger than my hourly wage. And he smiled at me when I handed him the cup, and the smile was genuine, and I noticed it. He started coming back, every Tuesday and Thursday, then Mondays, then most days. He was a graduate student in economics, finishing his MBA, and he was smart in a way that surprised me. Not just about money and markets, but curious, genuinely curious about the world. We talked about technology and business models and the future of software. He listened when I described what I was building in my thesis project, a lightweight data management tool I'd designed to solve a specific inefficiency problem I'd noticed in how small businesses handled their operational data. He didn't nod politely. He leaned forward. He asked questions. By December, we were meeting outside the cafe. By February, we were inseparable. He told me about his family early on, but he described it gently, the way you describe a thing you love and have complicated feelings about simultaneously. His mother, Eleanor Hartwell, was a woman of considerable social standing in New England. Old money, civic committees, charity boards, the kind of woman whose name appeared in local newspapers at least 3 times a year adjacent to the word philanthropist. His father had passed away when Daniel was in college, leaving Eleanor as the sole custodian of the Hartwell name and everything attached to it. She was, Daniel said with a small, careful smile, particular about certain things. I should have asked more questions about what particular meant. I was 23 and in love, and I believed, the way you believe things at 23, that love was sufficient armor. Eleanor Hartwell was 58 years old when I first met her, and she wore those years the way a general wears medals, as evidence of battles fought and won. She was slender and impeccably dressed, the kind of woman who made you feel underdressed no matter what you were wearing, not through any overt comment, but simply by existing in proximity to you and making you suddenly, acutely aware of every choice you'd made that morning getting ready. Daniel brought me to the family home in Greenwich for a weekend in April, 6 months after we'd started dating. The house was the kind of house that appears in architectural magazines, not because it's ostentatious, but because it's perfectly, deliberately tasteful in a way that takes enormous money to achieve and enormous effort to make look effortless. Eleanor met us at the door. She looked at me the way a jeweler looks at a stone brought in for appraisal. Not rude, not unkind, exactly. Just evaluating, cataloging, assigning value based on criteria I hadn't been informed of in advance. "Sarah," she said, shaking my hand, her grip precise and brief. "Daniel has told me you're studying computers." "Computer science," I said. "I'm finishing my thesis on data management systems." "How practical," she said, and turned to lead us inside. How practical. 2 words, delivered in a tone so neutral that they could be read as genuine or devastating, depending on how charitably you chose to interpret them. I spent the whole weekend interpreting them charitably. I should have understood from that first handshake that Eleanor Hartwell had already made up her mind about me. Not because she was cruel, though I would come to understand that she could be in the precise, bloodless way that only certain kinds of power produce. But because I didn't fit the template she had designed for her son's future, and Eleanor was a woman who had very specific templates for very specific things, and she had not, in 58 years, allowed reality to deviate from them for long. I was not the kind of girl Daniel was supposed to bring home. I was the girl from Ohio. The girl whose mother cleaned houses. The girl who worked at a cafe and wore clothes from discount racks, and didn't have the kind of last name that meant anything to anyone in Eleanor's Rolodex. I was, in her private assessment, and I would later hear this in enough roundabout ways to be certain of it, a mistake that her son had not yet recognized as such. Daniel proposed 14 months after we met, on a warm June evening, in the garden of a restaurant in Cambridge, where we'd had our first real date. He was nervous in a way that undid me completely. This confident, effortlessly polished man, suddenly unable to get his words in the right order, his hands not quite steady. I said yes before he finished asking. We told Eleanor the following weekend. I watched her face when Daniel said the words. I was watching carefully by then. She smiled. It was a perfect smile. The kind of smile that had been practiced over decades of social events and charity dinners and difficult conversations. The smile that performed warmth without producing it. "How wonderful," she said. She kissed Daniel's cheek. She took my hand in both of hers and held it for a moment. "We'll have to have a proper celebration." And then, before I could respond, she turned to Daniel and said, "I hope you've thought about the prenuptial agreement, darling. It's just practical, given the family assets." She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't need to. The prenuptial agreement was the first formal declaration of what I was in Eleanor's view. Not a person her son was choosing to build a life with. A risk, a liability, a variable that needed to be controlled for. I signed it. Daniel felt terrible about it. He apologized more than once. He told me his mother's lawyers had been insistent. He told me he didn't care about any of it, that he'd spend every year of their marriage proving to me that the document meant nothing. I told him I understood, and I did. I understood Eleanor perfectly. I also understood something else. Something I had not told Daniel, had not told anyone, and would not tell anyone for a very long time. I was at the time I signed that prenuptial agreement in the final stages of a Series A funding round for a software company I had founded 18 months earlier, operating under a corporate name that bore no obvious connection to my own. The company was called Altis Systems. It was built on the data management technology I'd developed in my thesis project, refined over 2 years of obsessive iteration, and it had just received a $14 million investment from one of the most respected venture capital firms in Boston. I had not told Daniel, not because I was hiding it from him with any sinister intention, but because in the beginning, when we first met, it was just a project, a thesis, a hope. And then, when it became something real, something valuable, I found myself strangely reluctant to introduce it into a relationship I loved because it felt pure and separate from all of it. I was afraid of what money would do to something that felt so clean. I know. I understand how that sounds. I was 24 and idealistic and in love, and I made the choice that felt right at the time, and I kept making it, longer than I should have. I signed the prenuptial agreement protecting assets I didn't officially have, and I walked into the Hartwell family as Sarah, the girl from Ohio, the one who majored in computers, the practical one, the one who didn't belong, and I let them believe it. Here's what our marriage looked like from the outside. Beautiful. Genuinely. Daniel was a good husband in most of the ways that matter. Attentive, kind, present in the ways his mother had not trained him to be, and that he'd arrived at on his own. He made me coffee every morning, remembered small things I'd mentioned months ago, defended me to his friends when they made comments that carried the particular texture of old money condescension. He tried. Here's what our marriage looked like from the inside, specifically from the inside of my relationship with Eleanor. A slow, steady campaign of diminishment, so polished and consistent that I sometimes wondered if I was imagining it. She never raised her voice. She never said anything that could be directly quoted as an insult. She was far too sophisticated for that. What she did instead was operate in the space between words, in tone and timing and emphasis, in the small social maneuvers that redirect attention and reframe status without ever leaving fingerprints. She would discuss the guest list for family events with Daniel directly, mentioning my name as an afterthought. She would offer me advice on our home's decor, on my wardrobe, on social conventions she deemed I lacked, in a tone so gracious and solicitous that I had to remind myself that unsolicited advice delivered consistently to only one person in a room is not helpfulness. It is a statement. She introduced me at her social events with biographical details that were technically accurate and emotionally precise in their effect. This is Sarah, Daniel's wife. She grew up in Ohio, a small town, very down to earth. She's been doing some computer work, haven't you, Sarah? As though I were a hobbyist, as though I were a project she was gently tolerating. She had a name for it, delivered in these moments with the particular gentleness of a woman who considered herself kind. She called it, making sure people understand where you're coming from, dear, so there are no misunderstandings. I understood what it was. If you've ever felt invisible inside a family that was supposed to be yours, if you've ever sat at a dinner table surrounded by people who speak around you rather than to you, if you've ever smiled and nodded and said thank you when what you wanted to say was something very different, then you know exactly what I mean. And if that's your story, you're not alone. Subscribe to this channel, because these stories are for you. Meanwhile, quietly, on the other side of a firewall that Eleanor Hartwell didn't know existed, Alta Systems was becoming something extraordinary. The technology we'd built solved a specific problem, but we had solved it so elegantly, so completely, that it turned out the problem was everywhere. Enterprise companies dealing with fragmented operational data. Logistics firms hemorrhaging efficiency across disconnected systems. Healthcare networks drowning in siloed information that couldn't speak to each other. We had the solution. And once the market understood that we had the solution, the calls came quickly. Our second round of funding closed at $61 million. I had brought in a chief operations officer, a brilliant woman named Patricia, who had run operations at 2 previous successful exits, and who understood, without my having to explain at length, exactly the kind of leadership culture I wanted to build. I remained involved at the technical and strategic level, doing most of my work remotely. In the home office I'd set up in the study of the house Daniel and I shared, behind a door I usually closed. Daniel knew I worked. He knew I consulted. He knew I had a tech thing that kept me busy. He had, I think, a general impression of competent freelance work, the kind of thing you do when you're smart and trained, but perhaps haven't found your professional footing yet. He never pried. He was incurious about money in the way that people who have never lacked it tend to be. I didn't correct his impression. Every time I tried to bring myself to say the words, "I need to tell you something about what I've built," something in me retreated. The lie by omission had become load-bearing. I was afraid of what its removal would do to the structure around it. That was my mistake. I own it fully. But I want you to understand that my silence was not deception in the service of malice. It was the mistake of a woman who had grown up in a family where financial stability was precarious and private, who had married into a family where her financial insufficiency had immediately been weaponized, and who had found, in the separate kingdom of her own building, something that felt safe from all of it. I was protecting something, and I held on too long. In the 4th year of our marriage, Eleanor announced the charity gala. She had been organizing it for months, a formal fundraising event for a children's hospital foundation she'd chaired for 15 years. The event was significant. Several hundred guests, black tie, held at a private venue, with a live auction and a seated dinner, and all of the social architecture that Eleanor Hartwell operated within, like a fish in water. She called me on a Wednesday afternoon, which was unusual. Eleanor generally communicated with me through Daniel, a routing that maintained a certain plausible indirectness. "Sarah, dear," she said, "I've been thinking about the gala, and I'd love for you to be more involved this year." I felt the particular wariness that Eleanor's warmth had trained into me over 4 years. "Of course. What did you have in mind? I know the formal events can feel a bit overwhelming for you, all the socializing with people you haven't met. I thought it might be less stressful if you were part of the operational side of things, helping with the catering coordination, making sure the service staff has what they need, managing the evening's logistics." A small pause. "It's vital work, really. The event couldn't happen without people handling those details." I held the phone, and I was quiet for a moment. "You want me to work the event," I said. "I want you to contribute to the event," she said, and her tone remained warm, and her language remained technically accurate. "You've mentioned before that you feel disconnected from this side of our family life. This would be a way to be truly part of it." I held the phone and I breathed. "I'd love to help," I said. Because here is the thing about the move Eleanor had just made. It was elegant. In one suggestion, she had simultaneously excluded me from the social event, where I would have stood beside Daniel as his wife, as an equal, and created a plausible narrative for that exclusion. I was choosing to contribute in a different way. Practical, down to earth, Sarah, helping with the logistics because that's what she's good at. I would be in the room as staff, and the room would be full of everyone who mattered in Eleanor's world. She had been planning this for a while, I think. It had the feeling of something arrived at through deliberation rather than impulse. And this is where I have to tell you about the conversation I had with Daniel. I told him that evening. I described exactly what his mother had proposed, in exactly those words, and I watched his face. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm sure she just meant that the logistics are important. She's not trying to. She's asking me to work as staff at her formal event, I said, in front of everyone she knows. Sarah, she's going to have me carry trays, Daniel. He looked pained. He looked genuinely pained, and I want to be fair to him. The pain was real. He wasn't a man who wanted this. He was a man who had never learned how to stop it. I'll talk to her, he said. What will you say? I'll explain that you should be there as a guest, as my wife. And when she gives you 15 reasons why that misunderstands her intention, and when those 15 reasons are all technically irrefutable, what will you say then? He didn't answer, because he knew, and I knew, and we both sat with the knowledge that Daniel had never successfully altered a single thing his mother had decided. Not once, in 4 years, had he won a confrontation with Eleanor. Not because she was overtly aggressive, but because she was surgically precise, and because she had 40 years more practice at it than he did, and because he loved her, and because she knew exactly how to use that. He talked to her. She reiterated the original framing with slight variation. He came home and told me she'd meant no offense, that it was a practical matter, that the event was too important to the foundation to risk any confusion in the logistics. I looked at my husband, and I saw, clearly and completely, in that moment, what kind of man he was. Not a bad man, not a cruel man. A man who had chosen, over and over again, the path of least resistance in the direction of his mother, and who had convinced himself that this was something other than a choice. I said, "All right, I'll do it." He looked relieved. He said, "Thank you for being understanding." That was when I made my own decision about the gala. Let me tell you what I did in the 3 weeks before the event. I called my attorney, not the family attorney the Hartwells used, but my own personal attorney, whom Eleanor didn't know existed, and I arranged a wire transfer through the charitable arm of Altus Systems' corporate structure. $5 million, designated as an anonymous donation to the Children's Hospital Foundation, delivered through the proper channels, with specific instructions that the announcement was to be made at the gala itself, and that the identity of the donor was to be revealed that evening. Then I arranged, through an intermediary firm, for a profile piece on Altus Systems' CEO to be scheduled for release in the Wall Street Journal the following Monday. The piece had been in progress for several months. Patricia had been handling the PR, and I simply confirmed the timing. Then I found the most beautiful dress I owned, and I had it cleaned and pressed and hung it in the back of my closet, behind the safe in our bedroom wall, where I kept the documents that pertained to the life Eleanor didn't know existed. And then I went to the gala. The venue was a historic estate about 40 minutes outside the city, a property that had been donated for civic events, the kind of place with original crown molding and marble floors, and a grand staircase that swept down into a main hall large enough to hold 300 people without feeling crowded. The catering was handled by a company Eleanor used regularly. The flowers were extravagant. The lighting was the expensive kind that makes everyone in the room look as though they have been lit by a professional. I arrived early, as I had been instructed, in dark slacks and a white button-down. The informal uniform Eleanor had suggested would help me blend with the service team. I had my hair pulled back. I wore flat shoes. I carried nothing except a small radio to stay in communication with the event coordinator. Eleanor was already there when I arrived. She saw me, assessed me, and I watched something settle in her face. A tiny private satisfaction, the expression of a plan proceeding as intended. She touched my arm. "You look wonderful, dear," she said. Very sensible. The event coordinator, a professional and efficient woman named Margot, who clearly had no idea about any of the family dynamics, briefed me on my responsibilities. I was assigned to the champagne service in the main hall during the reception hour, circulating with trays, keeping glasses filled, directing guests to the auction items. And so I stood in the hall that Eleanor Hartwell had built, in her world, surrounded by her people, and I circulated with a tray of champagne. The guests arrived in a wave, black tie, gowns, the women wearing jewelry that didn't need to announce itself because the quality spoke before the quantity did. I recognized some of them from family events. Most of them didn't recognize me, which was exactly as Eleanor had intended. I served a woman who had attended my wedding. She looked at me with the polite, impersonal expression we extend towards service staff and said, "Thank you, dear," and took her glass. I served a man who was one of Daniel's childhood friends. He didn't look at my face. I moved through the room like a ghost in a house I had briefly lived in. And then something unexpected happened, which is that I stopped feeling humiliated. I don't know exactly when it shifted, but somewhere between the third time I was addressed as "you there" and the fourth time someone's eyes moved through me to the person beside me, something in my chest went very quiet and very still, like the moment before a storm when the air stops moving entirely. I was thinking about a specific thing. I was thinking about the girl in Ohio at the kitchen table with the second-hand computer and the borrowed book. I was thinking about the 5 hours of sleep and the ramen and the thesis project and the 14 million and the 61 million and the conversation I'd had with my attorney 3 weeks ago when I'd authorized the transfer of $5 million to the very foundation whose party I was currently catering. I carried my tray. I refilled glasses. I smiled when addressed. I was the calmest I had been in years. Daniel arrived 45 minutes into the reception. He came in with his mother, both of them dressed impeccably, and I watched them make their entrance. Eleanor's entrance, really, because Daniel was the accessory to it, not the other way around. She worked the room with the practiced ease of someone for whom this was oxygen. Cheek kisses and warm greetings, and that smile, deployed with precision, full wattage. Daniel found me about 20 minutes later. He was crossing the room, and our eyes met, and I watched him stop. Just for a second. A very small freeze, quickly recovered. He came toward me. His expression was a complicated mixture of things I recognized: discomfort, apology, something that was trying to be love and finding itself obstructed by other things. "Sarah," he said quietly, "how are you doing?" "Fine," I said. "Champagne?" He didn't take a glass. He looked at the tray in my hands and then at my face. "I'm sorry," he said. It came out low, barely above the ambient music. "I should have. I tried to. Daniel," I said, and I kept my voice even. "I'm working right now." He stood there for a moment. I watched him search for something, some rebuttal or gesture or action that would make this better without requiring him to do the difficult thing that would actually make it better, which was to go to his mother and say clearly and publicly that his wife should not be serving champagne to their wedding guests. He didn't find it. He nodded. He moved away. I refilled 3 glasses and took my tray to the kitchen for replenishment. At 8:45, the formal program began. The guests moved from the reception hall to the dining room. I was reassigned to the water service during dinner, moving through the seated tables, keeping water glasses filled, staying peripheral, staying invisible. I moved through the room steadily and quietly, and I listened to the conversations at the tables, and I thought my own thoughts, which were calm and clear and had the quality of something seen from very high altitude. Eleanor gave a speech. It was polished and genuine in its way. She did love this foundation, I believe, in the manner that she loved things. Practically, managerially, in terms of what she could do for them and what they reflected back about her. She spoke about the children's hospital with real warmth. She thanked the committee. She listed the programs the gala's proceeds would fund. I stood at the back of the room with a water pitcher. Then the host, a charming, silver-haired man named Dr. Calloway, who had apparently been the MC for this event for several consecutive years, returned to the podium for the fundraising announcements. He spoke about the year's donations. He praised the regular contributors. He read some totals that generated appreciative applause. Then he paused. That specific pause, the one a skilled speaker uses when they know what's coming, will require a moment of preparation. This year, he said, we received a donation that I have to say, in all my years with this foundation, I have never had the privilege of announcing before. A single anonymous gift, designated for the new pediatric research wing. He looked out at the room. $5 million. The silence that followed was the expensive kind. Then the applause began, and it was different from the earlier applause, less polite, more genuine, the kind that happens when people are genuinely astonished. Eleanor was at the head table. I watched her face from across the room. She was applauding. She was smiling. She was also, I could see, recalibrating, wondering, the way everyone in the room was wondering who it was. In Eleanor's world, a $5 million anonymous donation was a significant social event, even before the identity of the donor was known. It implied someone in their circle. It implied someone with means and the sophistication to give anonymously, which itself communicated a kind of status. Now, Doctor, Calloway said when the applause had settled, we were given permission to reveal the donor's identity this evening, with the donor's request that the announcement be brief. I think you'll all be as surprised as I was. He looked down at the card in his hand, then up at the room. The donation was made through the corporate philanthropy division of Altis Systems. Polite recognition from some corners of the room. Tech people, Boston people, not Eleanor's crowd entirely. Altis Systems, Dr. Calloway continued, is a software technology company founded here in Massachusetts that closed its most recent funding round at, I have to make sure I'm reading this correctly, $240 million. The room changed. I could feel it from where I was standing. The company was founded by its CEO, who is, as it happens, with us tonight. He looked up from the card. He looked around the room. Then he looked at me. He had been told where I would be standing. Sarah Hartwell, he said, would you come up here? I set down the water pitcher on the nearest surface, and I walked through the room. The walk felt very long. It also felt, in some private internal way that I struggled to describe accurately, like the most natural thing I had ever done, like walking back toward myself after a very extended absence. I heard the sound of the room, the murmur, the collective intake, the shift and readjustment of 280 people simultaneously revising the image they had formed of the woman walking through their center. I had been invisible for the past 3 hours. Now I was the only thing in the room. I reached the podium. Dr. Calloway shook my hand and stepped aside. I stood at the microphone and I looked out at the room. I looked at Eleanor. She was very still. All of her social mechanism, the smile, the posture, the practiced ease, had suspended. She was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It took me a moment to identify it, because I had never seen it directed at me before. She was uncertain. I looked at Daniel. He was staring. His face was working through something complicated. Surprise first. Then, more slowly, a kind of understanding that was clearly arriving with significant secondary effects. He was understanding not only what he was hearing, but what it meant about everything he hadn't known. And I saw, in his face, the particular grief of a man who had made choices that he could not now undo. I turned to the room. "Thank you," I said into the microphone. "This foundation does extraordinary work, and the children this wing will serve. I hope it can be something that lasts." I paused. I should clarify that the gift was made anonymously because I believe the work should speak for itself. But I'm glad to be here tonight and to be able to say in person, the investment is worth it. Applause. I thanked Dr. Calloway. I stepped back from the microphone. I did not look again at Eleanor. I had said what I came to say, and it had not been directed at Eleanor at all. Not really. And that was the final point I wanted to make, in the only language she fully understood. The language of a room full of her peers, of social consequence, of status and significance. I had made that statement not to wound her, but to be visible, to exist in that room as what I actually was. The revelation was not revenge, it was a correction. The dinner resumed, or tried to. The room had a different quality now, the way a room does after a significant thing has happened, and everyone is attempting to return to normal while processing the fact that normal has been redefined. I sat down at a table, not the table I had been assigned to, not the service station, but one of the guest tables, where there was an empty seat, and where 3 people immediately made space and introduced themselves with a warmth that had not been present an hour ago when they might have asked me for more water. Eleanor came to me approximately 20 minutes later. She crossed the room with composure intact, her expression reconfigured into something gracious and searching, and she sat in the chair beside me. "Sarah," she said. "Eleanor," I said. A pause, the kind of pause that holds a great deal. "I had no idea," she said. "I know," I said. "You should have told us." I looked at her, and I kept my voice even and kind, because I had not come to this evening to be cruel. I had never wanted to be cruel, and because I meant what I said. You had decided who I was before I walked in the door. What I told you wouldn't have changed that. What I could demonstrate, that you couldn't argue with. She held my gaze. Something moved through her face. Something complicated and ungovernable and, I think, genuine. It was the closest I ever saw Eleanor Hartwell come to an unmanaged emotion. She didn't apologize. I hadn't expected her to. She was not, at her core, a woman built for that kind of accountability. Not with me. Not that night. But something had shifted. The template she'd built had been removed, and she was standing in front of whatever was underneath it. And I think she was surprised by what she felt there. She said, "You are not what I thought you were." "No," I said. "I wasn't." She stood. She returned to her table. Daniel found me after dinner, near the exit, while the evening was winding into the auction portion, and the room's attention had redirected. He looked the way a person looks when they have been running from something and have finally stopped running. Not because they wanted to stop, but because there was nowhere left to go. "Sarah," he said. There was so much in just my name. "I didn't lie to you," I said. And I want to be precise about this, because precision matters when you're describing the landscape of a marriage. I had a company. I built a company. I did not tell you the scale of what it became, and I should have. That was wrong of me, and I know it. "Why?" he asked, and the question was genuine and hurt. "Because I was afraid," I said. "Because this family made me feel from the beginning like my worth was provisional, and what I was building felt like the one thing that was entirely mine. I held on to it too long. I'm sorry for that." He was quiet. Then, what happens now? I had thought about this. I had thought about it carefully over many months, and the answer had become clear to me in the way that answers do when you stop trying to avoid them. "I think," I said, "that we have built something on a foundation that wasn't honest, and I think we both know that. I think you are a good man who made choices that he convinced himself didn't add up to what they added up to. And I think I am a woman who stayed too long in something that was costing more than it was giving." I paused. "I think we both deserve better." He didn't argue. I think on some level he had known this was coming, not from the evening, but from the long accumulation of days before it. He nodded once. There was grief in it, real grief, and I felt my own. We loved each other. I want to be honest about that. The love had been real. But love, by itself, is not enough to sustain a marriage. You need also to be seen. You need also to be defended. You need also to be chosen, not once, at the beginning, but over and over again, in the small, daily moments where a choice is available and a person makes it. He had not made those choices, and I had not been honest. And between the two of us, we had built something that looked solid from the outside and was hollow in the places that mattered. The divorce was handled quietly. Eleanor did not fight it, I think. Whatever else she was too proud to pursue a conflict she knew she had lost. Daniel and I separated cleanly and fairly, assisted by our respective attorneys, and I moved into an apartment in Boston that I had purchased 6 months earlier, which tells you something about the level of clarity I had achieved before the gala ever happened. The Wall Street Journal profile ran the following Monday. The architect behind LT Systems, how a self-taught engineer from Ohio built a $250 million enterprise. It was a good piece. Patricia was quoted extensively. I was photographed in the Alti's office, at a desk that faced a window, the kind of photograph that suggests a person in the middle of work rather than in the middle of a performance of work. My phone rang constantly that week. People from the gala, journalists, a former investor who wanted to discuss our next round, 2 board inquiries from foundations that had apparently been following our work, and one message which I found 3 days after the article published, delivered through an intermediary, a brief, handwritten note from Eleanor. No apology, no explanation, just these words. I misjudged you. That was my loss. I held the card for a long time. Then I set it on my desk and returned to what I was working on. I want to tell you what I know now, from the other side of all of it. I know that I should have been honest with Daniel earlier, not to protect myself legally, not as a strategy, but because the person you share your life with deserves the whole of you, including the parts you've built in private. Secrecy, even secrecy born from self-protection, is corrosive. I carried that lesson with me. I know that Eleanor Hartwell was not simply a villain. She was a woman who had organized her world around a very specific set of values and hierarchies, and within those values, she operated with consistency and, in her own way, integrity. She was wrong about what those values meant. She was wrong about what human worth consists of. But she was not acting from pure malice. She was acting from the deepest convictions she had, and those convictions had never been seriously challenged before. The gala was, in some ways, the first time they were. I think she learned something. I don't know how much. But I think something shifted. And I know this, most of all. The years of small humiliations, the introductions designed to minimize me, the assignment to serve champagne at my own in-laws' charity event, the prenuptial agreement, and the careful exclusions, and the particular smile Eleanor deployed when she wanted me to understand my place. None of it destroyed me. Not because I was unusually strong, but because I had something that Eleanor didn't know about, something she couldn't account for in her assessment of me, which was the thing I had built in my own name, from nothing, in the kitchen of the house I grew up in, with a second-hand computer and a borrowed library book, and the simple, unkillable certainty that the world had room for me. The world has room for you, too. That's the thing about building something in secret, not in deception, but in dedication. It accumulates without anyone's permission. It doesn't require validation. Doesn't need to be introduced at a dinner party to be real. It's real because you made it real, and no one can retroactively change that. Eleanor thought she knew what I was worth because she could see my background, and my clothes, and my mother's occupation, and the fact that I hadn't grown up in a house like hers. She didn't know what I was worth because she had never actually looked at me. That was her limitation, not mine. I'm writing this from the Alti Systems main office, which moved last year into a new building in Cambridge, a building I own outright, which still strikes me as slightly absurd whenever I think about it directly. My team is extraordinary. The work is good. We are, by every measure I care about, building something that matters. I am, for the first time in a long time, living in a house where I don't feel like a guest in someone else's story. I have my own story. It started at a kitchen table in Ohio, with a girl and a machine, and the particular stubbornness that comes from having nothing to fall back on but your own intelligence and effort. It ran quietly and invisibly through the years of ramen and late nights, and a marriage, and a mother-in-law who served me champagne service duty at her charity ball. It surfaced on a winter evening in a room full of people who had looked through me for 3 hours, when a man at a podium said my name, and I walked across a marble floor and stood in the light. The silence that followed was different from the one at the beginning of this story. Not the silence that makes you feel small. The other kind. The kind that comes when the room is holding its breath because it has just understood something it didn't understand before. I have been both kinds of silence now. I know the difference. And if anyone ever tries to tell you that your value is determined by where you came from, by what you wear, by the size of the town you grew up in, or the names in your family tree, or the job title on the business card you may or may not yet have, remember the woman with the water pitcher. Remember that the most dangerous person in any room is the one who has been underestimated for so long that she stopped correcting people. True class is not what you inherit. It's not what you wear or what neighborhood you grew up in or which names you can drop in conversation. True class is how you treat the person you believe has nothing. It's the question you ask yourself when no one who matters, by your reckoning, is watching. Eleanor Hartwell treated the woman she thought had nothing with precisely the contempt she was capable of concealing, and she concealed it well, with grace and with practice. But it was contempt nonetheless. And what she never understood, the fundamental error in the entire accounting, is that the woman she thought had nothing had everything that actually mattered. She had built something. She had earned something. She had become something. In silence and without permission, and completely on her own terms. Revenge, they say, is a dish best served cold. I'd add to that, it's best served without saying a word, without a raised voice, without an accusation, without a single moment of cruelty. It's best served by simply, finally, being seen as what you actually are. And then walking out into the rest of your life. That's what I did. And it was, I can tell you, worth every single glass of champagne. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to see you clearly, if you've ever smiled and stayed quiet and kept building something the world didn't know existed yet, subscribe to this channel. These stories are for you. Hit the notification bell and stay with us. Because there are more of these stories, and every single one of them matters.